Welcome to Jespiracy, the podcast that delves into true crime and mystery stories from around the world. I'm your host, Jessica, and in each episode, we'll explore the details and theories surrounding some of the most notorious cases in history. From unsolved mysteries to infamous killers, we'll examine the evidence, discuss the impact of these crimes, and attempt to uncover the truth. So, grab a cup of coffee and join me on this journey as we navigate the murky waters of the unknown and attempt to unravel the mysteries of the world around us. The information in this episode is compiled from available public sources, and while every effort has been made to ensure accuracy, it is presented for informational and educational purposes only. This podcast does not aim to accuse or implicate any individuals or entities, including law enforcement. The details provided are intended to shed light on the documented aspects of this case and are shared with respect for those involved. Many factors can prevent homicide cases from receiving the full attention that they deserve. Limited funding, understaffed departments, and strained resources are often to blame, particularly in lower-income areas where cases involving marginalized victims tend to be overlooked. Tragically, individuals dealing with substance abuse or those working in vulnerable fields, like sex work, often see their cases deprioritized. When a victim checks all of these boxes, their case can easily get buried in the back of an overcrowded file cabinet. However, it becomes much harder to ignore when multiple women from the same community and social circle are found dead under similar circumstances within a few years. While some suspect a serial killer, others wonder if these cases were buried not just from oversight, but perhaps due to darker motives, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and excuses. On May 20th, 2005, just outside Jennings, Louisiana, Jerry Jackson was settling in for a quiet morning of fishing on a bridge overlooking the Grand Mere Canal. As he unpacked his gear, opened a soda, and readied his line, something in the water below caught his eye. And at first glance, he thought it might be a mannequin, recalling recent news stories about mannequins mysteriously disappearing from local stores. But as he looked closer, something felt wrong. Mannequins don't draw swarms of insects. Realizing that this was, in fact, no mannequin at all, Jerry quickly grabbed his phone and called 911. Within minutes, police arrived and began to pull the lifeless body from the murky water. The woman, dressed in blue jeans and a white blouse, looked no older than 30 years old. Her body bore no visible wounds aside from a small scab on her scalp. Toxicology reports would later reveal a mix of antidepressants, cocaine, and a blood alcohol level of 0.16, leading investigators to consider drowning or asphyxiation as likely causes of death. Fingerprints helped identify the woman as Loretta Shason, a 28-year-old mother of two, a Jennings local, and a sex worker. In the years leading up to her death, Loretta Shason wrestled with a cocaine addiction that gripped her life. Her 5-year marriage was unraveling, and there were times that she'd disappear for days, chasing her next high. But Loretta always came back home, returning to her husband and her sons. She made efforts to turn things around, trying rehab, working to break free from her struggles, yet somehow the drugs always found their way back into her world. According to her husband, the last time he saw her was on May 15th, 5 days before she was found. She'd come home after a bender, asking for a little money to buy food, hugging her boys before heading out again. Neither of them knew that that would be their final goodbye. The last confirmed sighting of Loretta was 2 days later, on the morning of May 17th. She was seen getting into a truck with a man named Frankie Richard, a local figure with a reputation as a pimp. Later, she and Frankie were spotted at the Boudreaux Inn, which was a rundown motel known for drug activity and sex work. There, she reportedly used drugs with 2 other sex workers, Muggy Brown and Nicole Guillory. After that, Loretta's trail went cold. To understand what was happening in Jennings at the time, it's important to picture the town as it was. About 3 hours west of New Orleans and just north of the Gulf of Mexico, Jennings is part of Jefferson Davis Parish, an area rich in Cajun culture and known to some as the boudin capital of the world, for its beloved Cajun sausage. The parish system itself dates back to French and Spanish rule, operating almost like small religious counties that retain a unique character to this day. A parish is essentially Louisiana's version of a county. Back in 2005, Jennings had a population of only around 10,000 people, creating a close-knit yet also a deeply divided community. North of the railroad tracks was home to the town's upper class, which were your lawyers, judges, your business owners, and on the south side is where the working class lived, your oil field workers, plumbers, mechanics, many of whom relied on jobs at the oil and gas refineries in the neighboring parish. These massive industrial sites dotted the landscape, impacting the air, water, and food supplies around Jennings, a reality that shaped the area's harsh industrial atmosphere. Now add in a growing drug trade along the local stretch of I-10, and Jennings becomes a town weighed down by tough challenges and lingering shadows. And Loretta Chason's death was just the beginning. Her mysterious end would be followed by others in the same tight circle, darkening the already heavy air over Jennings. On June 18th, less than a month after Jerry Jackson's unsettling discovery of Loretta's body, another tragedy unfolded just off of Highway 12. That evening, a group of boys was out catching frogs in the swamp when they noticed something in the water. A body drifting near the bank. They called 911, and soon after, police recovered the remains of a young woman. She was black, dressed in cut-off jean shorts with a deep incision across her neck. Her face was so battered it was nearly unrecognizable. After some investigation, the police identified her as 30-year-old Ernestine Mary Daniels. She was a local sex worker who had been missing for 2 days. And like Loretta, Ernestine had struggled with substance abuse and a difficult past. She tried to get clean and find peace, often turning to her faith, only to find herself pulled back by her struggles. There was, however, a critical difference between the two women. Ernestine had faced racial prejudice in her community. One incident in 2004 stood out vividly to her sister Jessica after Ernestine's death. The two had been walking home one night when an unmarked police car pulled up beside them. The officer inside began to question them, making degrading comments about Ernestine's struggles and her work. When Jessica tried to defend her, Ernestine urged her to ignore the threats and to keep walking. But before the officer drove away, he delivered a chilling warning. He'd kill them the next time he saw them. When Jessica reported the incident, she claimed the station laughed it off, refusing to file a report. And after learning of her sister's death, this memory took on a new and disturbing significance. But rumors suggested Ernestine had crossed paths with other dangerous people in her final hours, and on June 16, 2005, she was last seen with 2 men, Byron Chad Jones and Lawrence Nixon. With suspicions mounting, police began looking into Jones and Nixon as possible suspects. Nixon's wife provided them with a disturbing lead. She claimed that on the night Ernestine went missing, the 2 men had returned to her house with a blood-soaked garbage bag, which they left on the porch until a white vehicle came to collect it. Even more unsettling, their teenage daughter recalled her father coming home that night covered in blood. In early 2006, the Jennings Police Department finally arrested Byron Chad Jones and Lawrence Nixon, charging them with second-degree murder in connection to Ernestine's death. But there were some troubling details. The police didn't examine Nixon's home as a potential crime scene until 15 months after the incident. And by that time, They reported that the site showed no trace of blood. Following this assessment, the charges were dropped against both men, with authorities citing a lack of evidence to pursue the case. It was a decision that raised questions. Was this oversight? Or was there more behind the delay? Why wait so long to investigate the scene? Could the police have been protecting the suspects? The unanswered questions just kept growing. And on March 18, 2007, the stack of case files in Jennings grew again. That day, police responded to a call about another body discovered in the Pettyjohn Canal on the town's outskirts. This time, the victim was a young woman found naked, except for a gold ring and a single sock. She had a tattoo of 2 interlocking hearts on her lower right leg and was identified as 21-year-old Kristen Gary Lopez, a young woman reported missing just days before. Kristen had no visible injuries, no bruising to her face, no signs of broken bones, leaving her cause of death officially undetermined, though investigators suspected asphyxiation. Kristen's life had mirrored those of the previous victims in many ways, and though she was younger, she too struggled with addiction and supported herself through sex work. But unlike the others, Kristen had an intellectual disability and had been abandoned by her family, left to navigate her harsh circumstances alone. And by now, the pattern was impossible to ignore. 3 young women from Jennings, each between 20 and 30, each grappling with substance abuse, and each involved in sex work, all of them found dead in water. And all 3 of these young women knew one another. Unfortunately, it didn't stop there. In May 2007, another tragic discovery was made along Highway 102, near the same area where Ernestine's body had been found. This time, it was 26-year-old Whitney Dubois, a young Caucasian woman who, like Kristen, was found completely nude. Whitney's body showed clear signs of trauma. She had been badly beaten, especially around her face, and like the others, she had a history of addiction and involvement in sex work, and her blood alcohol level was notably high. Whitney's brother had said his little sister had just been a lost soul. During the investigation, one name kept surfacing: Frankie Richard. He was known to the victims not only as a local pimp with a violent history, but as someone who had been close to them. Frankie had built a reputation as a father figure to Kristen Lopez and was one of the last people seen with Floretta before her death. Raised in Jennings, Frankie had initially tried to lead a different life, working in the oil industry, but after a workplace accident left him with a broken back in the 1980s, he took his settlement and opened up a strip club. With this venture, Frankie found himself entrenched in the local drug trade, ultimately deciding it was easier to join it than fight it. He began dealing drugs himself and offered his employees for sex work, primarily operating out of the Boudreaux Inn, a motel that had already come up earlier in the story, and by the mid-2000s, Frankie was deeply connected with several women in Jennings, including Kristen, Loretta, and Whitney. He claimed these relationships were built on shared struggles, saying he bonded with them over their traumas and addictions. And according to Frankie, the business was a means to help these women break free and start new lives. But there was a darker side to his influence. Frankie admitted to a history of violence, a serious crack addiction, and an intimate involvement with many of the women he claimed to see as family. Then, in May 2007, Frankie's face appeared all over the local news. He was wanted in connection with Kristen Lopez's death, and by May 16th, Frankie was in handcuffs, along with his niece Hannah Connor, who was a childhood friend of Kristen's and who was also considered a suspect. The police based Frankie's arrest on a critical piece of witness testimony. On the night before Kristen died, she and Frankie had reportedly fought after she took some items from his hotel room. Frankie, however, denied any involvement, maintaining that he hadn't harmed Kristen or any of the women. He suggested that the victims had stumbled upon something that they weren't supposed to know. Now, it's possible that Frankie had been telling the truth, because just a short time after his arrest, all charges were dropped against him and his niece after a witness had recanted her story. Once again, police stated there wasn't enough evidence to convict them of the crimes against them, and it was also found out that Frankie had been in rehab during one of the murders. With few leads left, the police found themselves back to square one, and by spring of 2008, the person or people responsible for these brutal murders was on the hunt for another victim. On Thursday, May 29th, the family of 23-year-old Laconia Muggy Brown received heartbreaking news. Muggy's body had been discovered, fully clothed in a peach tank top and denim cutoff shorts, but with the signs of terrible violence. She had multiple wounds around her neck and her head, and unlike the others, her body was left in the middle of a rural road, doused in bleach rather than in a canal or a swamp. Muggy's grandmother, Bessie, had last seen her granddaughter the previous Friday night when Muggy mentioned she was going to a friend's for dinner. Muggy never came home, which was deeply worrying as she had a young son to care for. Like the previous victims, Muggy had fallen in with a dangerous crowd, frequenting the Boardrow Inn and struggling with substance abuse. She knew the 4 previous victims, and shortly before her death, she confided in her grandmother that she had a foreboding feeling something terrible was coming her way, and tragically, her intuition proved right. Just 3 months later, in late August 2008, yet another young woman vanished from Jennings. 24-year-old Crystal Shea Benoit Zeno disappeared, and 2 weeks after her family's hope began to dwindle, hunters found her decomposing body along a riverbank. Crystal, like the other victims, was entangled in drug abuse and knew many of the women who had been killed. Her body was in such a severe state of decomposition that the autopsy could not conclusively determine her cause of death. Then, in November 2008, another young life was claimed, and on November 15th, 17-year-old Brittany Gary was discovered in a field off Highway 11. Her death added yet another devastating mark on Jennings. Brittany's cause of death was suspected to be asphyxiation and mixed drug intoxication, just like Loretta's. And in a tragic twist, Brittany was the cousin of Kristen Lopez, who was the 4th victim, drawing yet another close link between the victims. Brittany's death brought the total number of victims in Jeff Davis Parish to 7. Finally, in December of 2008, Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff Ricky Edwards publicly addressed what had been weighing on the entire community's minds. He formed a special task force to collectively investigate the murders and confirm the investigators believed the murders were linked to a, quote, common offender. But for some time, the task force felt like a move that came too late. With 7 women already dead, many wondered if more lives could have been spared had resources been mobilized sooner. Yet, even with the task force in place, they were unable to prevent another murder. In August 2009, Nicole Guillory became the 8th victim. Nicole, who was a 26-year-old sex worker, was known to have connections with the previous victims and shared the same harrowing struggles with addiction. She had a lengthy record in Jennings, but strangely, many of her charges had been mysteriously cleared. And according to her mother, Nicole had been highly anxious and afraid in the weeks leading up to her death, refusing even to make plans for her 27th birthday. She confided in her mother that she was certain she wouldn't live to see it. 2 weeks before her birthday, her mother reported Nicole missing, and on August 19, 2009, Nicole's body was found along I-10 highway, making her the first victim to be discovered outside Jefferson Davis Parish. Toxicology reports revealed cocaine and painkillers in her system, and though no signs of trauma were found, asphyxiation was again suspected as the cause of death. Now, there was a surveillance video shot by a private investigator that had been investigating the deaths that captured a video of Nicole just before she became a victim. She was seen in an area frequented by many of the women. With 8 women gone, it was clear that this case was far more than isolated incidents. It was a harrowing pattern that continued to haunt Jennings. With the addition of one more tragic death, the group of victims came to be known as the Jeff Davis 8. It seemed like the work of a serial killer, but the pattern was unusual. Serial killers rarely targeted groups of people who knew one another, and as the deaths continued to mount, the handling of the case by the police casted a dark cloud over the town of Jennings, leaving residents with a growing fear and suspicions. Families of the victims voiced serious concerns about the investigation, or lack thereof, to the Jennings Daily News. They revealed that law enforcement had never once contacted or questioned them regarding their loved ones' deaths or disappearances. Loretta's husband, Scott, raised a painful question. Why did it take 7 victims for the authorities to establish a task force? This wasn't the first instance of questionable police work in Jefferson Davis Parish. Both the Jennings Police Department and Jefferson Davis Sheriff's Office had long-standing reputations of scandal and corruption. Even beyond the Jeff Davis 8, the area had seen 12 unsolved homicides since the 1990s, an alarming high rate for such a small community, with an unusual low clearance rate for its size. Many locals had already suspected the police were deeply entangled in the local drug trade, and in 1990, for instance, 2 men robbed the sheriff's station, reclaiming 300 pounds of confiscated marijuana and what was rumored to be an inside job orchestrated by the chief deputy sheriff and none other than Frankie Richard. Scandals continued to emerge over the years, further eroding public trust. And in 1993, Sheriff Dallas Cormier pleaded guilty to charges related to improper dealings with inmates and the misuse of public funds for personal vehicles and firearms. Then, in 2000, a Jennings officer committed a chilling crime. He killed his fellow cop and the cop's wife in their home before turning his gun on the responding officers. And in 2003, 8 female officers from Jennings filed a lawsuit against several male officers, citing sexual harassment and violence. And in 2013, former police chief Johnny Lasseter was implicated in yet another scandal, accused of stealing cash, pills, cocaine, and marijuana from the evidence room. With each incident, Jennings residents grew more skeptical of their law enforcement, wondering if those meant to protect their daughters and wives might actually be leading them into danger. Many began to believe that the very people sworn to serve and protect were, in fact, contributing to the community's darkest fears. All 8 victims of the Jeff Davis 8 had one more troubling detail in common, something that I haven't shared with you yet. Each of the 8 victims had reportedly worked as an informant for the local police, often providing information about the drug trade in the area. Now, it could explain why so many of them had a deep-seated fear in the weeks leading up to their deaths. Not only were they young women involved in high-risk work, but they also carried the dangerous knowledge of their informant roles, and some of the victims may have known that the other victims had been informants too. Several of these women had been questioned about the other victims before they themselves turned up dead. Muggy Brown, for example, was interrogated by police regarding Ernestine's murder, and rumors swirled that Muggy had seen Loretta's body in the canal before the police officially received the report. Kristen Lopez was also questioned about Loretta's death before her own murder, and it raised an obvious question. Why didn't law enforcement do more to protect these witnesses when they started to turn up dead? After all, their job is to protect and serve, but instead it seems these women were left vulnerable. Nicole Guillory's mother, Barbara, believed her daughter might have actually seen police committing a crime, and that this knowledge may have led to her death. Now, shortly after Kristen Lopez's murder in 2007, Chief Investigator Warren Gary purchased a truck, and this particular truck had reportedly been seen picking up Kristen on the day that she had vanished. The truck had originally belonged to a woman named Connie Siller, who was actually incarcerated and happened to be close to Frankie Richard. Witnesses claimed that the truck had bloodstains inside. Gary bought the truck from Siller for $8,000, promptly cleaning it, and then resold it for $15,000. Rather than being reprimanded for purchasing a truck from an inmate that could have possibly contained evidence in one of the murders, Gary was promoted to head of the evidence room. One Jennings officer, Jesse Ewing, was deeply disturbed by the unprofessionalism by the chief investigator and the rising body count among police informants. He conducted his own investigation, interviewing people connected to Frankie Richard and Connie Siller, and he found even more disturbing evidence. People openly told him they gave that truck to Gary to destroy the evidence. Ewing took his findings to a private investigator and then relayed them to the FBI. But instead of being rewarded for his diligence, Ewing was charged with obstruction for bypassing the chain of command. His law enforcement career ended, and the truck, likely a critical piece of evidence, disappeared. So what does this all mean? Was Frankie Richard shielded by certain members of law enforcement? And why would an officer who uncovered potential misconduct be punished instead of commended? Frankie, after all, had a lengthy criminal record that seemed to vanish as quickly as it was created. We aren't talking about drug charges or lesser crimes. We are talking about crimes such as rape, murder charges that disappeared from his record. Witnesses claimed that he even had a key to the task force office, coming and going freely. Allegedly, in 2009, the sheriff ordered that every investigator working the Jeff Davis 8 case be swabbed for DNA in response to the accusations against investigators. However, the office refuses to comment on the results of the DNA testing. Even if there wasn't a cover-up by law enforcement, and I'm not suggesting that there was, but the pattern here suggests an equally devastating reality. The police appeared indifferent to the safety and deaths of marginalized women, women involved in sex work or who struggled with addiction. And this indifference isn't unique. According to recent data, nearly 43% of female murder victims over the past decade have been sex workers. As one local, Mary Drake, put it in a 2019 documentary, quote, "They could find 10 people for the murder of one man in Lake Arthur in a couple of weeks, but they couldn't find the killer of 8 women over years? What does that tell you? They didn't care about these women, and it's just wrong." That's all for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in and joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. Your support helps more than you know. Also, please be sure to check out my YouTube channel, where I'll be sharing video versions of these episodes, along with exclusive content. And if you have any suggestions for future episodes, or want to share your own stories, please feel free to reach out. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and always remember to look beyond the headlines.